Well, as many of you know, the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah celebrates the retaking of the temple in Jerusalem by the Maccabees from the occupying Seleucid Empire. Now, many of you are familiar with this story. Some of you may not be. One of the reasons for my retelling of it is that it is a story for all of us, and it doesn't ask me to take on a role in a Jewish tradition that I'm not entitled to, nor am I expert enough. So I'm going to share this story from the knowledge that I have, and then we are going to hear a story from I believe he's a local rabbi, Rabbi Gelman. But we end with a story that it was shared by Ellen Cormier. So the title of my sermon is The Mighty Maccabees and the Miracle of Light. The Maccabees were a band of Jewish resistance fighters led by Judah Maccabee a long time ago. This is in the ancient Near East. The Seleucid Empire was a Greek state occupying what's now the Middle East. And the Seleucid reign lasted from about 300 to 60 before the Common Era. And the Maccabean revolt began in 167 BCE. So that's about 200 years before Jesus died. Now, in 165 BCE was when the temple was taken back and rededicated, but the story, and that's what's celebrated, of course, with Hanukkah, but the backstory to the revolt, I think, is interesting. To begin, it's important to know that the Seleucid Empire was the center of Hellenism, and that was a fusion of the ancient Greek world, the classical Greek art, literature, theater, and philosophies, and language with the cultures. This was fused with the cultures of the Middle East, North Africa, and Southwestern Asia. It was a time of the Stoics, of Epicurean, of Euclid, Archimedes, and the Septuagint. And the Septuagint is a Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures. So Hellenism was a kind of melding or fusing, as I said, what I like to say is like a smash up of cultures, right? And because they were conquerors and rulers, they often had their own way, and other cultures, indigenous peoples of the land, or those who were being ruled, had to accommodate, or sometimes they would be released from this life, right? So, because often these rulers were not the most well-adjusted people on the earth, right? And they could be cruel and intolerant. So the Hellenists also had a habit in that way of syncretizing their religion with the religions of the lands they occupied. And this surprisingly even includes Buddhism in part of India. But during the time leading up to the Maccabean revolt, many Jewish people had become quite Hellenized, and in the process were sometimes remiss in adhering to the dietary laws and the many rituals and observances that not only made them distinct as Jews in their living, but also made them acceptable before their God religiously. Now, for those of you who grew up in the Jewish faith, maybe whether you were Reform, conservative, or Orthodox, you know that Judaism is a very ethical religion, but it's also very exacting, right? Can be very exacting in adhering to Torah law. And I remember in my Hebrew scriptures class in seminary, when we learned all of the things that you could do and you couldn't do, and the things that made you unclean, like you couldn't touch a dead body, you couldn't come in contact with blood, you couldn't eat certain things, and if you did, you'd have to be cleansed before you could go to the temple and pray, or in some way be before God. And I often thought to myself, if I were a Jewish woman in an ancient Near East, I would have been dead pretty quickly because I could not keep up with all of those things. But you grew up that way, you were acculturated that way, right? So, but these things were important to the Jewish people. And so, but for many Hellenistic Jews, compromise was necessary, as I said, to live, work, and trade peacefully with these Seleucid occupiers. Now, there were other Jewish people in the occupied Judea who judged their compromising fellows harshly. They cited the need to observe Torah law consistently in order to remain distinct in identity and practice. The traditions of the Jewish people must not be diluted, they said. It could mean bringing the wrath of God of Israel upon them. So, in the meantime, the Seleucid rulers maintained a live and let live policy towards Judaism. They didn't force their Hellenistic practices on them, but in 175 BCE, Antiochus IV, whom Josephus, the Jewish historian, referred to as a psychopath. I'm not sure that language was exact, but something like that. He was nuts, right? So, and we don't know anything about that, right? Rulers that, despots, unbalanced, no. So in 175 BCE, this Antiochus takes the Seleucid throne, and he allows himself to be bribed by a Judean named Menelaus, who sought to be named the high priest in Jerusalem. Now, there existed in Jerusalem, by permission of the Seleucid rulers, the equivalent of a city council, kind of like it was all Jewish people, and they kind of ruled the Jerusalem themselves. And the council suspected that this Menelaus had looted temple reserves to pay the tribute, and it was also discovered that Menelaus invited Antiochus into the temple, which violated Jewish law. You couldn't step foot inside the temple walls if you were not Jewish. So the council hatched a plan to oust Menelaus, but when Antiochus found out about it, he saw the attempted coup as an act of sedition. And all of a sudden, the tables turned on that tolerance. Antiochus enslaved or killed thousands of people in Jerusalem. The temple was syncretized, circumcision and dietary laws were banned, and there arose a division between pro-Seleucid and traditionalist Jews. Antiochus then sent enforcers out into the smaller cities and towns around Jerusalem to set up altars dedicated to Greek gods and enforce worship among Jews of these Greek gods to prove their loyalty. In the year 167 BCE, before the Common Era, in the town of Modin, about 20 miles west of Jerusalem, a Jewish priest named Maccabees refused to comply with the forced worship. He killed a fellow Jewish person who attempted to approach the Greek altar, and he killed the Greek officer sent to set up the altar. Well, Maccabees had to head for the hills, literally, to the nearby mountains. A year later, Maccabees died, and his son Judah Maccabee, or Judah the Hammer, organized a band of anti-Seleucid fighters attacking Seleucid enforcers in the countryside and driving Hellenized Jews off their land. So they were oppositional and attacking not only the foreign occupiers, but their own people who appeared to be acculturated to the Hellenistic way of life. So for good or for ill, the Maccabees, as they became collectively known, destroyed altars and burnt villages. And when they became strong in number, they engaged a full-scale revolt using guerrilla warfare tactics. They chose their battles in more rural areas outside Jerusalem. They didn't take on Jerusalem itself, or the center of power, but they attacked with speed and agility and easily retreated back into the mountains if they became overwhelmed. It just reminds me a lot of the Afghan people, right, who resisted Russia, for crying out loud, and also the Ukrainians, who are holding their own, granted at much loss, but the superpower is losing much more. There were several battles in which the Maccabees prevailed, even though they were outnumbered and outpowered. An effective tactic evened the odds in the Battle of Emmaus, when Judah marched his warriors through the night and descended on a Seleucid camp at dawn, catching them completely unawares. Now, the battles continued for 3 more years, but then Antiochus died on a trip to Persia, and the Seleucid army decided, we're going back to Syria. So in 165, Judah Maccabee rode into Jerusalem triumphant. This is where the story of Hanukkah and the miracle of light begins. I want you to imagine for a moment that you walk into this sanctuary and it's been vandalized. You see the chalice stand toppled over and it's in pieces on the chancel steps. The pulpit's been overturned and ugly words are spray painted around on the walls and windows. Numerous chairs are broken and overturned. The hymnals are strewn all around, spines broken, pages torn out. And in Osiris, the 7 principles banners have been yanked down and torn, and more spray paint insults appear. What has been the most meaningful to you in terms of your religious and spiritual life has been savagely attacked. Think for a moment how that would make you feel. Would you be brokenhearted, angry, vengeful, thankful it wasn't worse? The Maccabees must have experienced these things when they entered the temple in Jerusalem, the most sacred place of worship. And really, there was only one, and it was in Jerusalem, the most sacred place of worship for Jewish people that had already been destroyed once and rebuilt. This was the second temple. It contained the Holy of the Holies, as they referred to it, the inner sanctum, the place where the God of Israel could alight and smell the pleasing smell of burnt offerings. And this inner sanctum had been defiled by the presence of the cruel Seleucid ruler, Antiochus IV. Some people think this is related to the book of Daniel, but anyway, some scholars think that Antiochus is kind of like the model for what would become the Antichrist, right? He was considered so evil, and he did some pretty nasty things, right? But this guy, they knew, had been in their temple, and there had been Greek gods placed in their portico. And one of Antiochus' most vengeful tactics was said to have slaughtered pigs on the temple altar. And again, if you're Jewish or if you know anything about the tradition, that really is the ultimate desecration. The Maccabees, when they came into the temple, they were desperate to cleanse and purify it. And in order to do that, the Jewish priests needed untouched, undefiled oil to light the lamps, as very particularly described in the Torah. So the story goes that they only found one container of oil that was sealed, and that was thought to be from before the time of the corrupt priesthood. And according to legend, this was only a one-day supply, but it lasted until a new supply. 8 days it takes to press and prepare the oil. And so it was that this one day of supply was said to have lasted the 8 days until new oil could be made. It is a miracle, whether a myth, a legend, it actually somehow happened, doesn't matter. It's a miracle for which the Maccabees and many Jews then and now give credit to the God of Israel. The next year, Judah Maccabee arranged for an 8-day feast to commemorate 25 Kislev, the day the temple was cleansed and rededicated. Eventually, Hanukkah, the commemoration and ritual lighting of 8 candles over 8 days, became Jewish law. It's a day of praise and celebration, and the menorah candles are by law to be displayed in the home for all to see, inside and out, as a reminder of the freedom won by the mighty Maccabees with God's help for Jewish people everywhere. So think about this as not only a reenactment of 8 days of miraculous light, but it also comes in the winter, when in the Western Hemisphere, when lights are low, the northern hemisphere, when the days are short and the nights are long. So it's a celebration of light. But just as important, it's a symbolic of the protection of Jewish freedom and identity. I'm personally amazed at a 6,000-year history of a religion and identity that has remained strong and distinct in the face of diaspora, living in various places among different cultures, and sometimes, as we know, suffering terribly for who they are and for maintaining their identity in their face of their religion. But again, I ask that you think about your own identity as Unitarian Universalists. Unfortunately, we don't live in a time. We live in a time and a place where we enjoy religious freedom and toleration. But think about your Unitarian Universalist identity and what it means to you. And how you can live into that identity and what it means and take it out into the world. To really have a sense of what this religion and this place means to you. To help us understand and honor this celebration of freedom and bravery, as I said, Ellen Cormier sent me a story that I believe was in the West Palm Beach paper about from Rabbi Mark Gelman, as he imagines the first Hanukkah. It's called It's called Hanukkah's Light. So this, again, is imagine the first Hanukkah after the temple was rededicated. Rabbi tells us that the problem with the first lighting of the Hanukkah menorah was that everybody wanted to light it, and there were only 8 candles. So the soldiers were the first to say, well, the only reason we're here and celebrating this is because of us, right? And so we think we should light the first candle. So the soldiers lit the first candle. Well, then the priest said, well, if it wasn't for our role as priests, the temple would not have been cleansed and consecrated. So the priests lit the second candle. Then the oil makers said, well, we produce the oil for the lamps, so we're important, so we think we should light a candle, so they lit the third one. And then the farmers said, we grow the food. They lit the fourth one. Beekeepers said you wouldn't have food if it weren't for the bees. So the beekeepers lit the fifth one. And the teachers said, no one would know about the traditions and the stories without us. And so the teachers lit the sixth candle. And the tailors said, hey, we can't do this naked. So we need to light a candle. So they lit the seventh candle. And then finally the shepherds said, well, without wool, you wouldn't have a material to make the clothing. And so they lit the eighth one. But Hannah, who was a relative of, I believe it was Mattathias, said, hold on here. Everybody's griping and grousing. Why is there so much unhappiness here when we should be celebrating? All of us contribute to our community, to this celebration, and nobody is more important than anybody else when it comes to this first Hanukkah. So she said, let's look. You have individual candles here. Now, when does Hanukkah start? Tonight. And should I light a candle now? Should we light a candle now? No. Candles need to be lit after dark, after sundown, and they need to be lit at least 30 minutes after sundown. So imagine that these candles are lit, right? And Hannah says, look, you all stand as individuals here, and you all have your purpose and you contribute. But look what happens. When I turn the menorah around. Now, what can you imagine happens when Hannah turned all of those lit candles around? Robin? One candle. One bright, beautiful, shadow-chasing light, right? So yes, each one of us carries light within us, and each one is a light in our community. But when we join together in beloved community, we are one bright, joyous, shadow-chasing light for this time of year. May it be so. Now is the time in our service when we share our Sunday offering. We take an offering and we share it with a deserving organization in the community. It remains Propel, a nonprofit organization providing